Dear athletic directors, we need to talk about playoff expansion. Hello good sport, thank you for watching this video. Today we're talking about playoff expansion. And on this channel, this is College Football Media, we talk about teams, trends, and traditions to logos, history, and predictions. If that sounds interesting to you and you're new here, consider subscribing for in-depth college football content. Playoff expansion. Everybody has an opinion, and not every opinion matters. So, in this video, we're talking about the effects of what will happen when or if the playoff expands. One of the first effects that will happen will be that the regular season weakens. And that's an argument we've all heard before, but what exactly does it mean when pen meets paper? So ways that this will actually play out is that, one, lower attendance at the actual games in the regular season. If you're an AD, you know that you want to maximize attendance at your home games. And then if the playoff expands and you lose attendance during the regular season, therefore you lose money, and you don't want that to happen at all. Why would you lose attendance during the regular season if the playoff expands to 8 teams? Think about big games that have happened in the past couple years during the regular season, specifically even in September. Notre Dame and Georgia, Ohio State and Oklahoma. Those games have been really, really big, and they mattered. They were very interesting to everybody because they had playoff implications. And those playoff implications were, if you win the game, you have a really good chance to make the playoff. If you lose the game, you have a very, very highly decreased chance to make the playoff. Your whole season is on the line in September, and that makes the game interesting and therefore valuable, and it means a lot. Think about other games such as P5 conference games, such as Arkansas at Alabama or Rutgers at Ohio State. They're still Power 5 games, but they don't mean very much because it feels like Arkansas or Rutgers has no chance to win that game, and it doesn't have any implications in the long run. Those games are already struggling with attendance, and therefore if there's 8 playoff spots instead of 4, then that creates 4 extra spots for Alabama and Ohio State or teams of the like to make the playoff. It becomes easier, and therefore if they lose that game, they still have a good chance to make the playoff. Therefore attendance goes even lower for games even like Arkansas at Alabama or Rutgers at Ohio State. And a very similar thing would be a G5 school playing at a Power 5 school. A G5 school, frankly, is just not viewed upon at the same level as the very high-profile Power 5 schools. Again, those games are not drawing fans into the stands. And then if those schools have a much higher chance to make the playoff, then again, that value of that regular season game of a G5 versus Power 5 will again decrease. When the value of those games decrease, then less fans will have incentives to go watch the game in person because they're not invested, because it's not a valuable game. In essence, all of those regular season games become about playoff seeding instead of playoff berths. With how the structure currently stands, a playoff berth means everything. It is so valuable because there are only 4 spots in a pool of 130 teams, and then you can split that roughly in half between the G5 and Power 5. When you create more playoff bids or playoff berths instead of 4, and you increase that number, then really the great elite schools will only be worried about where they are seated instead of if they're going to make the playoff. And it creates a lot of drama when Ohio State or Alabama is not sure if they will make the playoff that year, instead of worrying about, are we going to be a 3 seed or are we going to be a 7 seed? The second effect that will happen if the playoff expands will be the discussion of whether we need auto bids. What I mean by that is if we have 8 teams, then it will be very likely that you have an automatic qualifier from, say, all of the Power 5 conferences. The champion of those conferences will automatically get a bid into the playoff. And there will also be discussion of whether there should be an automatic bid for one group of 5 school. If that happens, I think that it would be very likely that each year you would at least have a 2-loss team in the playoff. You could also see a 3-loss team, or maybe perhaps in some rare cases a 4-loss team in the college football playoff. Frankly, I believe that decreases the value of those playoff games because I don't want to see a team that has 3-4 losses in a playoff. The example of that would be, say, a Utah team or a Minnesota or Nebraska or Wisconsin team that perhaps have lost a couple games earlier in the regular season. They win their division, go on to the conference championship, and upset a undefeated or 1 loss, for example, Ohio State, Penn State, or Oregon, USC, somebody of that nature. 3-loss teams make their conference championship game probably more often than we realize. It is rare that they win those games. However, if they do, in the scenario of having auto bids, then they would make the playoff, no questions asked, even though their record or their strength of schedule and all of those things combined says that they probably are not worthy of being one of the top 8 teams. So let's say that a 2-loss team or a 3-loss team makes the playoff more frequently, and if they're not deserving to be there or can really hold their own weight against the other teams in the playoff, what happens? They create more blowouts. They will lose by a much larger margin. Even if auto bids don't happen, even if you still expand from 4 to 8 teams, I would assume that you would still have more blowouts. Frankly, the playoff system already has a problem with blowouts. There's not enough competitive games. You have the best 4 teams in the entire country, and yet you're still having teams getting blown out. For a quick example, if you say that a blowout is 20 points or more, the winning team has to win by a margin of 20, and you calculate through all the semifinals and national championship games, what are the results? By that rule, the semifinals are 50-50. There have been 6 semifinal games that have been blowouts and 6 semifinal games that have not been blowouts. In the national championship picture, there have been 2 blowouts and 4 not blowouts. Again, considering that the winning team wins by 20 points. And if you look closely at the games that qualified technically as not being a blowout, they would include in the semifinals Alabama beating Washington in 2016 and Alabama beating Clemson in 2017. And in the national championship, LSU beating Clemson this past season of 2019. In those games, Alabama beat Washington by 17 points, beat Clemson by 18 points, and Alabama had control of the whole game. Frankly, the reason it didn't go above 20 points is because Alabama's offense just did not score enough, but their defense held both teams to under a touchdown. Washington scored 7, Clemson scored 6. And then I think we can all agree from watching the LSU-Clemson game, that game felt like a blowout even though LSU won technically by 17. So if you put it into a percentage for the entire games combined, there are 44% blowouts in the playoffs. 44% of the time there is a blowout and 56% of the time is not a blowout. If you adjust for those games that I feel like have been blowouts, even if the score is not above 20, you can set a new margin to 14 points. If you set the margin for a blowout at 14, it moves those 3 games that I just talked about onto the side of being a blowout. That now means that 8 semifinals qualified as a blowout and only 4 qualified as not being a blowout. The national championship games now mean that there are 3 championship games that have been a blowout and 3 that have not. Under the rule of a 14-point margin being a blowout, 61% of the time there's a blowout in the playoff, and only 39% of the time the game is not a blowout. The playoff should be the best of the best. You should have close games, and that's what the playoff wants. Close games means good TV. It means interest. It means value. That's what you want. That's what you need as a playoff from a business perspective. And when you're not having close games, something feels a little wrong and maybe broken in and of itself. But if you expand the playoff, you'll only see more and more blowouts, which creates bad TV and bad entertainment and bad football. Back on auto bids, it also devalues the conference championship game. Let's say that the auto bids are only 5 for each Power 5 school, and the other 3 spots of an 8-team field are the best available teams. In that scenario, it is very possible that there are 3 teams that could lose their conference championship games and fill those other 3 spots. That means 2 out of 5 conference championship games, only 1 team would go on to the playoff. The other 3 out of 5, both teams would go to the playoff, and therefore, what's the reason, right, for playing that conference championship game in the first place? Then you have the argument for the G5. Let's assume that the G5, group of 5 schools, that would be Sun Belt, the MAC, American Athletic Conference, Mountain West, and Conference USA. Let's say that 1 team out of those 5 conferences automatically makes the playoff. If that happens, a lot of people assume that, hey, that's good for the G5. It helps everybody involved. But the thing is, the G5 could dominate themselves too. We see domination in the Power 5 already. Alabama, Clemson, LSU, Ohio State. Those are the teams. You could also include Georgia. Those teams dominate the upper echelon of college football. Who's to say the group of 5 wouldn't do the exact same thing? For example, Boise State could dominate the group of 5. UCF could dominate the group of 5. The AAC as a whole, one of those teams would just dominate year after year after year, making the playoff, and no benefit really comes to the rest of those conferences and teams. Unfortunately, those group of 5 teams just don't play the same kind of schedule as the rest of the Power 5 conferences. It's physically easier on their body. They're not being hit as hard or as often as, say, a Texas A&M. While it definitely is possible that a group of 5 school can beat a Power 5 school on any given day, that is possible. I understand that. But I don't want to see an every given day playoff. I want to see a season long, you've earned your spot, you're the best team in the country, and now you have to battle it out on the field. I don't want to disguise opportunity as excuses, because opportunity also comes in the regular season. You have to schedule hard, you have to play through it, you have to win those games and earn a spot in the playoff with how it currently stands. The third effect, if the playoff expands, would be more games. Of course, that seems like an obvious thing, but there are a lot of effects that we don't always think about when more games are added to the schedule. Travel would increase for both the teams and the fans. Travel costs money, and those fans have to spend a lot of money to go to all of these games, especially the playoff games that are oftentimes nowhere near where your school or university is. When you spend more, obviously that is a huge cost. And think about the teams that would be spending this money. They're not NFL-sized cities. The NFL specifically has large cities because they can support what it takes to run an NFL organization. Colleges aren't like that. They're oftentimes in college towns, which are much smaller. The large population of these college towns are the college students. The population drops during the summer. These college towns are not built to support NFL-sized organizations. And more travel and more spending, more games, it just creates a lot more things that you have to support from an organizational standpoint. Of course, obviously, it's also taxing on the student athlete. Again, sounds like an old argument, but think about it. Physically, obviously, that's the thing that we point out most often. Of course, it would be taxing on you physically. Football is anyway. It's also taxing on the student's exam schedule. That's always in the midterm of the semesters. and even the recruiting cycle schedule for coaches and the NFL draft schedule. Players want and need to finish the season to prepare for the NFL draft. If you extend the season out and play more games, it's harder to be ready and you have less time for the NFL draft. And obviously, bowl games would continue to decline. That would be a necessity effect if the playoff expands. Of course, your opinion on bowl games could vary. Some people still like them. Some people want to get rid of them altogether. But in essence, it definitely would decline the value of those bowl games. What people count, what people keep track of, varies on the access that you have to a playoff. People count Super Bowl berths, AFC Championship berths, and even making the NFL playoffs to a degree. In college basketball, you count tournament bids. If you make the tournament, that's a successful year. In football, it used to be counted by did you make a bowl game. But as you continue to expand the playoff, that wouldn't be a measuring stick as often anymore. It would be did you make the playoffs. Even if it's an 8-team field, that's what you would count. And it would not be as valuable as it is today of saying we made the playoff when there was only 4 teams. At the heart of the matter, everybody, both sides, are wanting to maximize interest versus maximizing interesting games. Are you trying to maximize interest in a select few games, such as the playoff, or are you trying to maximize the number of interesting games that you have? When you maximize the number of interesting games that you have more of those games that fall into that category in the regular season, how it currently stands. If you expand the playoff, the number of interesting games goes down because the regular season is devalued, and playoff games wouldn't rise in value like we expect them to because of the blowouts. That's my simple argument. It's just my opinion. You can agree with me, but be civil in the comment section down below. Are you also of the 4 and no more mentality as myself? And let me pose one more question. It's been brought up about an antitrust lawsuit being brought upon the Power 5 schools if the playoff expands to 8 and there's not a guaranteed spot for the group of 5. But what happens if a select few amount of teams in the Power 5 just leave the NCAA? That's also an interesting thing to think about. It might have to be a topic for another video. So, thank you for watching. This has been College Football Media. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and consider subscribing for in-depth college football content. Again, thank you for watching. Until next time, be goody now.